government's austerity policy, and all of our constituents can see the consequences of this in delays in responding to 999 calls and rising violent crime. Will we see the Chancellor today offering any additional funding for policing? The fear must be that the government will not even properly fund the police pension settlement.
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady is right to talk about policing and the incredible work the officers and staff do. But it's worth reminding the House that it was Labour that planned to cut police spending by 5 to 10% had they won the 2015 election. In 2017, Labour did promise an increase, but it wasn't enough, so because we increased it by more than what Labour promised, by 460 million. And Labour then went on to vote against the increase. There's not a single Labour MP that voted for an increase in police funding when they had the opportunity to do so. So we're not going to take any lectures from Labour on policing.
BTC David.
Question 10, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Atkin.
The government is very concerned about increases in knife crime and its impact on victims, families and communities. The action we are taking is set out in our serious violence strategy and includes new legislation in the Offensive Weapons Bill, the Community Fund to support local initiatives, the #KnifeFree media campaign and continuing police action under Operation Sceptre.
And David T.C. Dave.
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister knows, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act currently prevents the police from using past criminal convictions as grounds for determining whether a search is proportionate. Would she consider changing pace so that people who are stopped for a legitimate reason and who are found to have a recent criminal conviction for carrying knives can actually be searched by a police officer?
Well, of course, my honourable friend brings his experience as a special constable into the chamber, and I'm grateful to him for his service. We are clear that stop and search is a vital policing tool, and we're committed to tackling knife crime. Under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, officers already have the power to search an individual they suspect to be carrying a knife. We therefore believe current proposals to be proportionate, but we will keep them under review and continue to work closely with the police to ensure they have the tools they need. I'll be happy to meet the honourable friend to discuss further.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Home Secretary announced in September they would adopt the public health approach to tackling knife crime, a measure the Youth Violence Commission recommended following strong evidence that it works. Can the Home Secretary tell me when the House will be given the opportunity to debate this vital issue?
Minister.
Extremely grateful to the honourable lady for the work she does on the, with the Commission and indeed other members across the House. She will know through our scrutiny of the Offensive Weapons Bill how seriously we take the public health approach, and this is something that we have. This is something that we have looked at through the development of the serious violence strategy. She will know that there was a debate before the summer recess on serious violence, but I'm always happy, as she knows, to debate how we help support our police forces in tackling this terrible crime.
Strong pressure on time today, I'm afraid. Kevin Ollinrake.
Number 11, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Ben Wallace.
We've made significant progress since the National Crime Agency was established in 2013. Capabilities have improved, partnership working is better, and we intervene earlier to prevent serious organised crime. The agency has gone from strength to strength with an impressive and sustained track record of disruptions across the full range of serious and organised crime threats.
Thames Valley Police spent £7 million investigating the HBOS Reading banking scandal. Would my right honourable friend consider establishing regional fraud squads which will be self-funded from the proceeds of both fines and recovered funds to properly investigate business banking fraud and other financial crimes?
The honourable member, my honourable friend's suggestion is similar to what already happens through the regional organised crime units, in which we have injected £140 million in grant funding to help establish them, but also to ensure that we put in place the right financial investigators in each region to tackle fraud.
The organised crime crosses borders, and the NCA rely on the European arrest warrant, databases and joint operations with Europol, all of which will fall if we leave the EU without a deal in place in April. Given that Ireland has repealed its extradition arrangements for the previous 1957 convention, will there be any legal way to extradite organised criminals from Dublin if there is no deal?
The Right Honourable Lady makes a very important point about what happens post-Brexit. She will of course know that the negotiations with Michel Barnier are all about issues like that. I suspect Ireland will go along with whatever the European Union's deal is to implement, and we are seeking a security treaty in order that we can put in place many of these very, very important measures.
A sentence, perhaps, Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Organised crime often leads to bad drugs on our streets, and one of the ways to stop that, of course, is drug testing in festivals. The Minister agreed that he would write to police forces about the legality of this. What is the response?
Minister!
I think one of the best thing is for the honourable member's suggestion is to hear what he says. We've got to stem the demand for drugs, both recreational and by other users, and therefore it's important that we work with the police to deliver that.
West Streeting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question 12.
Secretary.
We will be launching a £200 million youth endowment fund to intervene with children at risk of serious violence. We will be consulting on a new duty to support multi-agency approach to tackling violence and undertaking review of drug misuse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The recent murder of a 23-year-old man in my constituency has once again brought the issue of violent crime to the forefront of concerns in my community. My constituents understand that whether in Labour-led cities like London or Tory shires, the reality is that cuts to police numbers are having a serious impact, which is leading to increases in violent crime across the country. When will the Home Secretary accept this and put the money back into the police that our communities need?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right to raise this, and he will know the government has a cross-government serious violence strategy, but we do need to do more, and that's why I recently announced these further steps, especially the new £200 million fund, which will help prevent violence.
Would my right honourable friend agree that we need to remain committed to steering young and often vulnerable people away from crime? What's the department doing to strike a balance between prevention and robust law enforcement?
Minister.
My honourable friend is right to raise this. We have this new £200 million fund that was announced earlier this month, and we also have an early intervention youth fund of £22 million.
Speaker, the Home Secretary might not want to take any lessons from Labour on policing, but in March, HMIC warned the lives of vulnerable policing could be at risk if cuts continue. In May, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner said she was certain his government's cuts have contributed to violent crime. In September, the NAO warned that the Home Office does not know if police forces are financially sustainable. And last week, the Home Affairs Select Committee declared the police could become irrelevant without serious investment in today's budget. Every one of these warnings have been ignored by government. Can he tell us why he thinks they're all wrong and he's right?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course the polices need to have the right mix of resources as well as other factors, and that's why we've increased police funding this year by over £460 million. But the Honourable Lady also knows it's not all about resources. So, for example, the changes in drug markets are playing a big role. That's why I hope she'd welcome the review that I've recently announced.
Mr. Noakes.
The Government is committed to protecting the rights of asylum seekers and ensures that those who would otherwise be destitute are provided with accommodation and other support to meet their essential living needs. We continue to work closely with local government, the devolved administrations, the private sector and civil society to make improvements to the services that are provided.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister will be aware that following a legal challenge in Scotland's Supreme Court by two of my constituents in Govan Law Centre, Serco undertook to put its lock change evictions on hold. However, is the Minister aware that Serco are threatening verbally my constituents, threatening them with lock change evictions? Does she agree that that's completely unacceptable, and will she investigate?
Minister Noakes.
It is important that the Home Office continues the work with Serco, with Glasgow City Council and indeed NGO partners as part of a dedicated task force to make sure that all those individuals who are no longer entitled to asylum support or accommodation are managed appropriately. He is of course right to point out that following the legal challenge by his constituents, no service users have been evicted whilst this appeal is still ongoing.
Finally, Bambos Charalambos.
Number 14, Mr. Speaker.
Minister Hurd.
Mr. Speaker, as taxpayers, we are investing over £1 billion more in our police system than we were 3 years ago. Recognition by this government about the increasing demand and complexity of demand on police, but also recognition of the progress we are making in reducing the deficits in our public finances, a progress jeopardised by the current Labour front bench.
Bambos Charalambos.
The Minister will no doubt be aware of the lamentable findings of the recently published Home Affairs Select Committee report, Policing for the Future. Does he agree with the report's conclusions that without additional funding for policing, that there will be dire consequences for public safety, criminal justice, community cohesion and public confidence? And would he join me in calling for the Chancellor to provide substantially more funding for policing in my constituency of Enfield Southgate and across the country?
I agree with much of the report from the HASC committee, including the need for more resources for policing, which is exactly what we are doing through an additional investment of £460 million by taxpayers in our police system this year, a police settlement that he and other Labour MPs voted against.
Order. Topical questions. Chris Stephen.
Number 1, sir.
Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, it's been a busy few weeks at the Home Office as we continue in our efforts to deliver for the British people. On Thursday, regulations allowing the medicinal use of cannabis-based products will come into effect, providing relief to those people, particularly children, who have known so much pain. And I will shortly be visiting the United States to monitor progress on my challenge to tech giants to help us fight child sexual exploitation. For those who fall short, there will be no place to hide.
Chris Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent on Friday was supposed to be moved by Serco to our new social housing accommodation following a successful claim. However, that did not happen, and Serco removed beds, heating and £22.50 in cash. Does the Secretary of State believe that Serco are a rogue provider of services and should be removed from their contract?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to take a closer look at the case that he mentions, the honourable gentleman mentions, but he will know that we've consulted on a new approach with the Scottish Government, with local government, with others, and we're confident that the new approach will see a significant improvement.
Gareth Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, over the last few months, we have actually seen a reduction in moped crime. Does this show what can be achieved when we take a multi-agency approach where resources are allocated and, crucially, where the police are allowed to pursue motorcyclists even though they're not wearing crash helmets?
Minister Hurd.
MP, I'm absolutely delighted that moped crime is down about 50% off its terrible peak, and that's a result of superb police action, but also the work convened by the Home Office, bringing together government, industry and civil society to bear down on this problem. So pleased are we that we're taking that model forward to tackle vehicle crime.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank Max Hill QC for his work as the reviewer of counter-terror legislation on leaving on the 12th of October to become Director of Public Prosecutions. But given his departure was announced on the 24th of July, why has no successor been appointed? Why has the post been left vacant with counter-terror legislation going through Parliament? What on earth is the Home Office excuse for this sheer negligence?
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we are about to start the process for his predecessor, but to suggest that this has somehow held progress back on counter-terrorism would be completely incorrect. The new counter-terrorism strategy was just launched a few months ago, and that sets out clearly how seriously the government takes this.
Mrs. Theresa May.
Will the government provide the assurance?
Order. This is really a matter of the utmost sensitivity and order. And the Right Honourable Lady's question must be heard, I think, with solemnity and respect. Mrs. Theresa Villiers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the light of the horrors of Pittsburgh, can the Home Secretary provide the reassurance that both the government and the police will always take very, very seriously the security of the Jewish community and other minorities who may be subjected to hate crimes and violence?
Mr. Speaker, I can absolutely provide my right honourable friend that reassurance. In fact, just this weekend, following that tragedy, I spoke to the head of the Community Security Trust to offer that reassurance. It's an organisation we're proud to support, but we want to look at new ways about helping the community with its own security needs. It is sad in this day and age that any community needs security of that type, but for as long as it does, we will always be there. And tonight I will be also attending a vigil to mark what happened at Pittsburgh, that terrible tragedy.
Thank you. Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The perpetrator of the Pittsburgh murders has a history of posting the most vile anti-Semitism, Islamophobia and threatening comments. And similarly, the man is suspected of sending pipe bombs to prominent Democrats, threatened the life of a political commentator via a tweet a few months ago, but Twitter said that it didn't violate its online guidelines. In the wake of these terrible tragedies, what is the government doing to address the very serious issue of online hate?
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is again right to raise this. And we've seen the role that social media is playing, not just in Britain, but abroad in feeding hate. And that's one of the reasons we just recently refreshed as government the anti-hate strategy that the government has. And this is exactly one of the things we'll be looking into further.
Aussie.
Speaker, this summer Rugby saw a number of illegal gypsy and traveller encampments on new housing sites. Now, our local councillor, Jill Simpson-Vince, brought together developers and Warwickshire Police to put a protocol in place. Can the Secretary of State encourage others to follow Warwickshire lead?
Splendid, thank you. Home Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, yes, I can.
Andy Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What progress has he made in compensating Windrush victims who've been made homeless and jobless by the government's hostile environment policy?
Minister Noakes.
I thank the honourable member for that question. He will know that Martin Ford QC recently asked the government, and we agreed to extend the consultation period for the compensation scheme so that we can make sure that we get the best responses possible and so that he can engage more widely with the community. In exceptional circumstances, the Home Office has already made payments to some individuals.
Thank you. Steve Double.
Mr. Speaker, meat and fish processing businesses in my constituency rely heavily on migrant workers. Many of their staff are highly trained, highly skilled, even though their skill is not formally recognised by a qualification. What steps are the government taking to make sure that these sort of skills are properly recognised in our future immigration policy?
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, our food and drink industry is vital to the success of our economy, and I know that many Cornish businesses are very successful in this sector. I can reassure my honourable friend that we will be taking these issues very seriously as we develop our new immigration system.
My constituent, Mr Jenkins, was born and bred in Bridgend. His wife of over 20 years has been told she has to leave the day before their child's 18th birthday. Why? What sort of hostile environment destroys family life in that way?
Minister.
If the Honourable Lady would care to write to me, I'd look closely at the case that she's mentioned.
Hands.
Speaker, next March will see the 40th anniversary of the assassination, a brutal assassination of Airy Neve on these premises. Airy Neve's family, my constituents, are seeking more information about the circumstances of the murder. I've been told that my questions on this have been transferred from the NIO to the Home Office, but will my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, agree to meet with me and Airy Neve's family to discuss how they can get answers on how and why Airy Neve was murdered 40 years ago?
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I will.
Good. Ruth George.
Go on. What will the Home Secretary do to help police forces prioritise resources when they are faced with cannabis clubs, of which most members require cannabis for medicinal reasons, and an epidemic of spice at the same time, which poses very serious risks to both health and law and order, but which are both Class B drugs?
Well, operating priorities are local decisions. What I can say to the Honourable Lady is the priority of the department is to make sure the police have got the resources they need to do their job, which is why we took steps to increase public investment in our police.
Grant.
May I seek an assurance from the Minister that any revised immigration policy will indeed reflect the needs of the farming and fishing community in Scotland and indeed the whole of the UK?
Minister.
I can give my honourable friend that assurance, and that's also one of the reasons we've recently launched a pilot for a seasonal workers' agricultural scheme for 2019.
Emma Reynolds!
Speaker, in the West Midlands we've lost over 2,000 police officers and violent crime is on the rise. Will the Home Secretary look again at funding for West Midlands Police, and will he reverse the imposition of extra pension costs?
Minister!
Well, I'm sure the Honourable Lady is aware that West Midlands received more funding this year, £9.9 million in a police funding settlement she voted against, and I will be coming to the House in early December with our proposals for 2019-20.
Mr. Speaker, town centres like the heart of the Irish community. However, on occasions they can become a target for antisocial behaviour brought on by the misuse of drugs and alcohol. What more can be done to ensure that we have a visible police presence in our town centres? And does my honourable friend agree that the sharing of back office functions with other emergency services to free up resources may be one of the solutions?
Grateful.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted that I'm visiting my honourable friend on Friday to see for myself the hard work she does in taking care of her constituents, working alongside her local police force. But this government supports greater collaboration and has placed a statutory duty on police, fire and ambulance services to keep to collaborative opportunities under review and enter into them where the interests of their efficiency or effectiveness.
Single sentence of Hobbesian liberalism, Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Small and medium-sized businesses are the lifeblood of most local economies, including my Bath constituency. However, they face many challenges in recruiting and the talent they need. Will the Minister consider reforming the Tier 2 visa system to make it easier and remove the prohibitive cost for smaller employees to recruit highly skilled overseas graduates from UK universities?
I think it contained quite a lot of semicolons. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share the honourable member's admiration for small and medium-sized businesses the country over. The immigration system already facilitates recruitment of foreign graduates of UK universities by waiving many of the usual requirements. We will shortly be setting out our plans for the future immigration system following the recent report by the Migration Advisory Committee.
In Bradley!
Following on from my adjournment debate on the subject and a letter from 20 police and crime commissioners, could the Minister confirm he shares my concerns about the impact of Mamba and Spice on communities like Mansfield, and that he will consider potential solutions to support the local police and services in tackling this issue?
Minister!
I salute the tireless campaign by my honourable friend and others. Spice is a scourge of many town centres at the moment. We take independent advice on classification. We keep that independent advice under review.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow, Martha Fernback would have turned 21. But sadly, her young life was cut short when at 15 she took an overdose of ecstasy. Her mother, Anne-Marie, now campaigns tirelessly for a new evidence-based approach to drugs policy. Would the Secretary of State consent to meeting Anne-Marie to hear why she believes a new approach is necessary?
Well, I am, of course, very sorry to hear that, as I'm sure the entire House is. The honourable member will know that the Home Secretary has commissioned an independent review of drugs so that we may understand better how drugs are used in the 21st century. And, of course, I would be honoured to meet her and her constituent to discuss this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we leave the European Union, we will, of course, have control of all aspects of immigration policy. Does the Home Secretary agree that we can then prioritise the highest skilled immigration as a way of boosting our nation's productivity?
Minister!
Yes, I agree with my honourable friend. That's exactly what we'll do, and we'll set out the approach in the White Paper in a few weeks' time.
Liz Twist!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since 2010, Northumbria Police has already had funding cuts of £140 million and lost 1,000 jobs. Now it faces an additional cost from employer pension contributions of 11 million, equivalent to 220 officers. Has the Minister pressed the Treasury to fund this cost before even more police jobs are lost?
Mr. Speaker, her local police force will be getting an extra £5 million this year, and she also know later this year we'll have the policing settlement, something I know she'll be looked forward to.
Indeed. Kirsten Hare.
The seasonal agricultural workers pilot scheme was warmly welcomed by both farmers and agricultural bodies across the United Kingdom. Can the Minister update farmers in my constituency around when further detail will be released?
Order. I hope the Minister heard. I hope the Minister heard her honourable friend. She did, otherwise we'll have to have a reprise. Minister.
My honourable friend for her question, and was delighted to meet her, to go to her constituency over the summer to meet soft fruit farmers who made a very compelling case for a seasonal workers scheme, and she will be no doubt delighted that the government is having a pilot on the horticultural sector to make sure that they can access the labour that they need.
There's that new young member, John Speller. Ah, there he is. Let's hear the fella.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I hope the Home Secretary will answer this question, because the reality is, in the West Midlands police area, crime is escalating, and the overstretched, understaffed police are feeling deeply frustrated as the criminals and the gangs take control of the streets, especially at night. When's he going to stop the rot, give the backing, give the resources to our police out there on the street every day?
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman knows West Midlands Police had an increase of almost £10 million this year. However, it is always worth listening to local forces. I'm happy to meet with West Midlands MPs, that I have done in the past, and listen more.
Thank you. Order.
Chivalry is not dead. Order. Before I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I must remind honourable members that copies of the budget resolutions will be available in the vote office at the end of the Chancellor's speech. I also remind honourable members that it is not the norm to intervene on the Chancellor of the Exchequer or the Leader of the Opposition. I now call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Right Honourable Philip Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Today, I present to the House a budget for Britain's future. A budget that shows the perseverance of the British people finally paying off. A budget for hard-working families who live their lives far from this place and care little for the twists and turns of Westminster politics. People who get up early every morning, who open up factories, shops and building sites, drop their kids off at school, check on elderly relatives and neighbours, the strivers, the grafters and the carers, who are the backbone of our communities and our economy. People who ask only of government that we protect the jobs that put food on their table, that we deliver the public services their families rely on, and that we do it efficiently, minimising the amount of tax we need to take from their hard-earned wages. People, Mr. Deputy Speaker, who we on this side of the House are proud to represent. So I say to them today, this budget is unashamedly for you. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the British people put their faith in us to do the job, and today we repay that trust with a budget that paves the way for a brighter future. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, let me be clear why. The tough decisions of the past 8 years were not driven by ideology. Mr. Deputy Speaker, they were not driven by ideology. They were driven by necessity and by the failure of the party opposite in government, which led to our deficit soaring to a post-war record and our economy suffering the deepest recession since the Second World War. That, Mr. Deputy Speaker, was our inheritance. And as ever, we did what needed to be done. Now we have reached a defining moment on this long, hard journey, opening a new chapter in our country's economic history, where we can look confidently to the future and set our course for where this remarkable country will go next. Because today, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can report to the British people that their hard work is paying off and the era of austerity is finally coming to an end. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am sure, like me, many members of the House keenly remember the last budget delivered on a Monday. It was 1962. I was 6 years old. Tensions between Russia and the United States were rising, and a former Foreign Secretary turned Chancellor delivered a budget amid cabinet revolt. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am acutely aware of the phenomenon of false memory, but I could swear I remember my parents turning to me and saying, "Philip, one day that could be you." Mr. Deputy Speaker, the media has been full of speculation about the timing of today's budget. Some were hoping for a December budget. I'm sure the headline writers were ready with something like "Spreadsheet Phil turns Santa Claus." Others were desperate. Others were desperate for it to be on Wednesday. Hamo House of Horrors, perhaps. But the truth is, by choosing today rather than Wednesday, I have not avoided the blood-curdling threats, the anguished wailing and the strange banging of furniture that's usually associated with Wednesday. I've been kindly invited to a special meeting of the 1922 committee this evening. Mr. Deputy Speaker, our economy continues to confound those who talk it down, and we continue to focus resolutely on the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead as we build a new relationship with our European neighbours, a new future outside the European Union. But as we do so, let us not forget the remarkable achievements of the British people in clearing up the aftermath of Labour's Great Recession. Because, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for all Labour's carping and relentless negativity, talking Britain down at every opportunity, we, the British people, have a record to be proud of. 8 straight years of economic growth. Over 3.3 million more people in jobs. Higher employment and lower unemployment in every region and every nation of the United Kingdom. Wages growing at their fastest pace in almost a decade. Income inequality lower now than at any time under the last Labour government. An economy back on its feet again. An economy working not for the few, not even for the many. An economy working for everyone. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we're at a pivotal moment in our EU negotiations, and the stakes could not be higher. Get it right, and we will not only protect Britain's jobs, businesses and prosperity, but we will also harvest a double deal dividend. A boost from the end of uncertainty and a boost from releasing some of the fiscal headroom that I am holding in reserve at the moment. We are confident that we will secure a deal which delivers that dividend. Confident, but not complacent, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So we will continue to plan for all eventualities, and I will do so at this budget with a three-pronged approach. First, I have already allocated £2.2 billion to departments for Brexit preparations, and in the autumn budget last year, I set aside a further £1.5 billion to be allocated for 2019-20. Today, I am increasing that sum to £2 billion. And in the coming weeks, the Chief Secretary will announce allocations to individual departments. Secondly, I shall today maintain the headroom to my fiscal rules broadly as set out in the spring statement, retaining firepower to intervene if the economy needs more support in the coming months. And thirdly, as I've been clear since moving to an autumn budget, if the economic or fiscal outlook changes materially in year, I will take whatever action is appropriate, if necessary, upgrading the spring statement to a full fiscal event. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the House can be confident that we are working for the best outcome for Britain and preparing for every eventuality. Mr Deputy Speaker, I shall first report to the House on the economic forecasts of the independent OBR, and I thank Robert Choate and his team once again for their excellent work. The OBR expect growth to be resilient across the forecast period, improving next year from the 1.3% forecast at the spring statement to 1.6%, then 1.4% in 2020 and 2021, 1.5% in 2022 and 1.6% in 2023. Mr Deputy Speaker, this government has prioritised getting people into work because the best way to help people is to provide them with the stability of a pay packet every month. Since 2010, over 3.3 million more people are in work, and today the OBR confirm Britain's jobs miracle is set to continue. Revising up participation in the labour market, revising down the country's equilibrium unemployment rate, predicting 800,000 more jobs by 2023. Now, by my calculation, Mr Deputy Speaker, that's over 4.2 million net new jobs since 2010, making the Shadow Chancellor's prediction of 1.2 million jobs lost out by just the tiniest margin of 5.4 million people. Roughly the population of Scotland. But now, Mr Deputy Speaker, we need to focus on pay. And with the proportion of low-paid jobs at its lowest since 1997, with regular pay growth at 3.1%, its strongest in almost a decade, and inflation forecast to average 2% next year, the OBR is forecasting sustained real wage growth in each of the next 5 years. A far cry, Mr Deputy Speaker, from the dismal picture that the Leader of the Opposition is so desperate to paint every Wednesday. That's what he wants. I turn now to the fiscal forecast. We inherited the highest budget deficit in our peacetime history. But after 8 years, the hard work of the British people is paying off, and we will not squander their efforts. Today's forecast, taking into account all announcements made since the spring statement, including measures I shall announce today, shows the deficit down from almost 10% under Labour to less than 1.4% next year under this Conservative government, and falling to just 0.8% by 2023-24. Borrowing this year will be £11.6 billion lower than forecast at the spring statement, just 1.2% of GDP, and is then set to fall from £31.8 billion in 2019-20 to £26.7 billion in 2020-21, £23.8 billion in 21-22, £20.8 billion in 22-23, and £19.8 billion in 23-24, its lowest level in over 20 years. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, we meet our structural borrowing target 3 years early and deliver borrowing of just 1.3% of GDP in 2021, maintaining £15.4 billion headroom against our 2% fiscal rules target. We are no longer borrowing at all to finance current spending. And today, the OBR confirm that our national debt peaked in 2016-17 at 85.2% of GDP, and then falls in every year of the forecast, from 83.7% this year to 74.1% in 23-24. That is lower in every year than forecast at the spring statement, and it means that we meet our target to get debt falling 3 years early, a turning point in our nation's recovery from Labour's Great Recession. Both our fiscal rules met, both of them 3 years early. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, Fiscal Phil says fiscal rules OK. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, while we are working to get Britain's debt down, to end the nightmare of wasting over £50 billion a year on interest, the party opposite would do the opposite. Their plans would increase tax and borrowing by £1,000 billion, taking our debt to GDP ratio soaring to well over 100% of GDP. A reckless and irresponsible policy from a reckless and irresponsible party. I've always been clear, sound public finances are essential, but they are not an end in themselves. So since I've been Chancellor, I have taken a balanced approach, putting an additional £60 billion into our public services and investment in our future, cutting tax for 31 million people, and all the while reducing borrowing and getting our national debt falling. Now we must do more, and thanks to the hard work of the British people, in this budget we can do more. I said at the spring statement that our careful management of the public finances was beginning to pay off, and that if the improvement we saw then continued, then I would be able to provide more support to our public services on a sustainable basis. Today, the OBR confirm a significant improvement in our public finances, an upgrade that underscores the hard work of the British people and this government's stewardship of this economy since 2010, and which means I can deliver on that promise I made in the spring, setting out a new path for public spending and a clear view for the British people of the fruits of their hard work. Next year, we will conduct a full spending review, setting our priorities for public spending within a sustainable funding envelope, deciding on the right balance between investing in Britain's future and current consumption of public services. Today, I have set out an indicative 5-year path for departmental resource spending, or RDEL as it's known to aficionados of public finance. For context, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the Spending Review 2010, average annual real growth was minus 3%. In the Spending Review of 2015, it was minus 1.3%. From next year, it will be plus 1.2% average annual real growth. But that is not the limit of my ambition. When our EU negotiations deliver a deal, as I'm confident they will, I expect that the deal dividend will allow us to provide further funding for the spending review. The hard work of the British people is paying off. Austerity is coming to an end. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, you will know better than most that every Chancellor likes to have a rabbit or two in his hat as he approaches a budget. But this year, some of my star bunnies appear to have escaped just a little bit early. In June, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, announced the single largest cash commitment to our public services ever made by a peacetime government, an £8.4 billion 5-year deal for our precious NHS, half as much again as the increase Labour offered the NHS at the last election. And let me be clear, we are delivering this historic £20.5 billion real terms increase for the NHS in full over the next 5 years. So in a very important sense, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we made our big choice for this budget 4 months before it was delivered. And this was the right decision. Our NHS is the #1 priority of the British people. And as we approached the 70th anniversary of its foundation, they had a right to know the scale of our commitment to it. But the British people also care that money invested in the NHS goes to the front line and to improvements in services. So we didn't just hand over money. We agreed that the NHS would produce a 10-year plan, setting out how the service will reform, how waste will be reduced, and exactly what the British people can expect to get for their money. That plan will be published shortly, but I shall give the House a sneak preview today. There are... I too can poach a rabbit every now and then. There are many pressing demands on additional NHS funding, but few more pressing than the needs of those who suffer from mental illness. And today, I can announce that the NHS 10-year plan will include a new mental health crisis service with comprehensive mental health support available in every major A&E, children and young people's crisis teams in every part of the country, more mental health ambulances, more safe havens in the community, and a 24-hour mental health crisis hotline. These new services will ensure that people suffering from a crisis, young or old, can get the help they need, ending the stigma that has forced too many to suffer in silence, and ending, too, the tragedy of too many lives lost to suicide. We are proud to have made this extraordinary commitment to funding our NHS, a precious institution that has been nurtured for most of its life by Conservative governments. Mr. Deputy Speaker, departmental spending allocations will be settled at the spending review next year. However, there are a small number of areas where I will provide further support now in order to deliver necessary certainty for forward planning. Local government has made a significant contribution to repairing the public finances, and this budget ensures local councils have more resources to deliver high-quality public services. We're giving councils greater control over the money they raise through the adult social care precept, through our plans for increased business rate retention from 2020, and by removing the housing revenue account cap so that councils can help to build the homes this country needs. We will shortly publish our Green Paper on the future of social care, setting out the choices, some of them difficult, for making our social care system sustainable into the future. But I recognise the immediate pressures local authorities face in respect of social care. So today, building on the £240 million for social care winter pressures announced earlier this month, I will make available a further £650 million of grant funding for English authorities for 2019-20 and an additional £45 million for the Disabled Facilities Grant in England in 2018-19, and will invest a further £84 million over the next 5 years to expand our successful children's social care programmes to 20 further councils with high or rising numbers of children in care, allowing councils to improve services for older people, for people with disabilities and for children in care now, while longer-term funding decisions will be made at the spending review. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the UK spends more on defence than any NATO member except the US. But over the last year, we've had stark reminders of the scale, scope and complexity of the threats we face. My right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, is working with the Cabinet Office and the Treasury to conduct a review into the modernisation of our armed forces in response to the evolving threat, which will form the basis for a comprehensive consideration of defence spending next year. But as a former Defence Secretary myself, I understand the immediate pressures our armed forces are facing. So I will today provide an additional £1 billion to the MOD to cover the remainder of this year and next, to boost our cyber capabilities and our anti-submarine warfare capacity, and to maintain the pace of the Dreadnought programme to ensure continuous at-sea deterrence. A deterrent, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that allows us to sleep easy in our beds, but one that the Leader of the Opposition and his shadow Chancellor have spent their political lifetimes campaigning to abolish. Nobody should be in any doubt that on this side of the House we are proud of our armed forces, and we will always back them with the investment they need to keep this country safe. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is not only our armed forces that keep us safe. Our counter-terrorism police play a vital role in defending Britain against the evolving threats we face. We committed in 2015 to spend 30% more on counter-terrorism capabilities over the current spending review period. And today, I commit an additional £160 million of CT police funding for 2019-20 to protect CT police numbers in 1920 and to allow future CT police funding to be considered in the round at the spending review. I recognise that policing more generally is under pressure from the changing nature of crime. I also recognise the representations made on this by many colleagues, such as my honourable friend, the member for South West Bedfordshire. And I can tell the House today that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, will review police spending power and further options for reform when he presents the provisional police funding settlement in December. Mr Deputy Speaker, as I have already set out, due to the hard work of the British people, public borrowing this year is coming in substantially below forecast. This allows us to provide additional support for public services in the spending review and contributes to the significant reduction in forecast debt this year. But I also want to use this good news to give a little bit back where it can be put to good use in this financial year. Mr Deputy Speaker, this year marks a century since the end of the First World War. And as we remember our fallen servicemen and women whose sacrifice ensured the freedom we enjoy today, many projects are raising money for veterans' charities from sales of commemorative items on which VAT is charged. Now, we cannot waive the VAT due on these sales, but we can make a donation with the VAT we will receive. And I commit today that the Treasury will mark the centenary of the armistice by making a donation of £10 million to the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust to support veterans with mental health needs. Many of our nation's village halls, Mr Deputy Speaker, were built to commemorate the sacrifice of World War I, and many of them are being refurbished to commemorate the centenary. So I will also provide funding for grants equivalent to the VAT chargeable on such refurbishment projects. And as our focus moves from the anniversaries of the First World War to the Second, I will also provide £1.7 million for educational programmes in schools to mark the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camps, ensuring the next generation hears the stories of those who survived the Holocaust and of the British soldiers who liberated them. Because, Mr Deputy Speaker, as the terrible events in Pittsburgh this weekend remind us, the battle against anti-Semitism did not end with the defeat of Nazi Germany. Across the length and breadth of England, our air ambulance services work tirelessly to get those with life-threatening illnesses and injuries quickly to the expert medical care they need. Funded entirely by philanthropy, they do a fantastic job. And today, I'm making £10 million of funding available to help them go on doing so. Mr Deputy Speaker, we are investing record amounts in our schools, and that investment is paying off, with 86% of schools now rated good or outstanding compared to 68% in 2010. But I recognise that school budgets often do not stretch to that extra bit of kit that would make such a difference. So today I'm announcing a £400 million in-year bonus to help our schools buy the little extras they need. A one-off capital payment directly to schools, averaging £10,000 per primary school and £50,000 per secondary school. And Mr Deputy Speaker, I have one final in-year measure to announce. Every Member of Parliament will testify that potholes are high on the public's list of concerns. So as autumn takes hold, I am making an additional £420 million available immediately to local highway authorities to tackle potholes, bridge repairs and other minor works in this financial year. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, if we want sustainable world-class public services and rising living standards, we must make the serious long-term reforms our economy needs to tackle the productivity challenge, to prepare our nation for the technological change ahead, and to show the next generation that our market economy can evolve once again to meet the needs of the new age. Because for us on this side of the House, ending austerity is not just about funding public services, it's about real wage growth, and it's about leaving more of people's hard-earned money in their pockets. This is the nation of the Industrial Revolution, of Stevenson, of Whittle, Lovelace and Faraday, people whose ideas shaped the world around them. And today, Britain once again can lead the world as we exploit a new wave of scientific and technological discovery pouring out of our universities and research institutes. And we can solve the productivity challenge if we are willing to embrace the future, to make the choice to invest in infrastructure, in research, in skills and in our regions, to manage change, not hide from it. Mr Deputy Speaker, I believe passionately in this agenda, but even I would admit that perhaps at the last two budgets I might have given the House just a little bit more detailed information on productivity and technological innovation than it's strictly needed. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, this time I'll leave it to the Budget Red Book to set out more details of the many measures we will take today. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, sensing the disappointment of my colleagues, I will just mention that this list in the Budget Red Book includes our commitment to technology with £1.6 billion of new investments to support our modern industrial strategy, ranging from nuclear fusion to quantum computing. £150 million for fellowships to attract the brightest talent to these shores from around the world, so that our scientific research continues to lead the world. And our commitment to infrastructure, expanding the National Productivity Investment Fund once again to over £38 billion by 2023-24, so that over the next 5 years, total public investment is growing by 30% to its highest sustained level in 40 years, and will, on average, be an astonishing £460 million a week higher in real terms than under the last Labour government. A Conservative government, Mr Deputy Speaker, investing in the roads, the railways, the research and the digital infrastructure that will power this country in the 21st century. Mr Deputy Speaker, half of the UK's £600 billion infrastructure pipeline will be built and financed by the private sector. And in financing public infrastructure, I remain committed to the use of public-private partnership where it delivers value for the taxpayer and genuinely transfers risk to the private sector. But there is compelling evidence that the private finance initiative does neither. The Shadow Chancellor, of course, rages against PFI at every opportunity, yet curiously forgets to mention that nearly 90% of those contracts were agreed by the last Labour government, leaving the nation with a bill of more than £200 billion to pay off, in what would be the most potent symbol of the economic mismanagement of the last Labour government, if only Gordon Brown hadn't sold the gold. Labour's policy is to terminate all these contracts, triggering the ruinous penalty clauses that they themselves agreed to in the first place, adding tens of billions more to an already enormous bill. A classic Labour solution, pouring good money after bad. I will not do that. We will honour existing contracts. But the days of the public sector being a pushover must end. We will establish a centre of excellence to actively manage these contracts in the taxpayer's interest, starting in the health centre. And we will go further. I have never signed off a PFI contract as Chancellor, and I can confirm today that I never will. I can announce that the government the government will abolish the use of PFI and PF2 for future projects, putting another legacy of Labour behind us. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we're investing in our nation's infrastructure and backing the technologies of the future. But we know that the real engine of growth is enterprise. The Right Honourable Member for Hayes and Harlington lists fomenting the overthrow of capitalism as his pastime. Mine is reinvigorating capitalism for the digital age. Because, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want Britain to be one of the great winners of the technological revolution. On this side of the House, we will always back enterprise and the market economy that underpins it, because we know it is the only way to deliver the high-wage, high-skill economy of the future. And as we finalise our departure from the EU and deliver a deal that secures Britain's future trade, we must unleash the investment that will drive our future prosperity. So today I can announce a package of measures to stimulate business investment and send a message loud and clear to the rest of the world: Britain is open for business. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am increasing the annual investment allowance from £200,000 to £1 million for 2 years, delivering on a long-standing ask of the British Chambers of Commerce. I'm providing a targeted relief for the cost of acquiring IP-rich businesses and introducing a permanent tax relief for new non-residential structures and buildings, partly funded by an adjustment in the special writing down rate for long-life assets from 8% to 6% to better align the tax and accounting treatment of these assets. To support British exports, we will increase UKEF's direct lending facility by up to £2 billion. We'll open the use of e-passport gates at Heathrow and other airports, currently only available to EEA nationals, to include visitors from the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia and Japan. And we will provide an additional £200 million of funding to the British Business Bank to replace access to the European Investment Fund if needed. We'll back another 10,000 entrepreneurs by extending start-up loans funding to 2021, and following representations from the FSB, I'm extending the new enterprise allowance, providing mentoring and support for benefit claimants to get their business ideas off the ground. And with thanks to my honourable friend, the member for Thurston Moulton, we're working with the FCA on expanding access to the Financial Ombudsman Service for larger SMEs. As well as backing businesses to invest and grow, we will also make sure British workers are equipped with the skills they need to thrive and prosper. We've introduced a new system of T-level vocational training, have put the first £100 million into the new national retraining scheme, and through the apprenticeship levy, we're delivering 3 million high-quality apprenticeships in this Parliament. But that system, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is paid for by employers, and it has to work for employers. So today, in addition to the flexibilities I announced earlier this month, I can announce that for smaller firms taking on apprentices, we will halve the amount they have to contribute from 10% to 5%. In total, this is a £695 million package to support apprenticeships. Mr. Deputy Speaker, as our economy evolves in the digital age, so too must our tax system, to ensure that it remains fair and robust against abuse, and that it raises the revenues we need to fund our public services. The employment allowance was introduced to incentivise businesses to take on employees, but at a flat rate of £3,000 per employer, it does not provide any real incentive for larger employers. So from April 2020, we'll target it at small and medium businesses with an employer national insurance bill under £100,000 a year. We will also bring the treatment of capital losses for the largest companies into line with that of income losses. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we recommit today to keeping family homes out of capital gains tax, but some aspects of private residence relief, extend it beyond that objective and provide relief for people who are not using the home as their main residence. So from April 2020, we will limit lettings relief to properties where the owner is in shared occupancy with the tenant and reduce the final period exemption from 18 months to 9 months. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have received representations that I should abolish entrepreneurs' relief and put the savings towards funding our NHS commitments. But I do not believe we can have sustainable public services unless we have a dynamic economy. And encouraging entrepreneurs must be at the heart of any strategy for a dynamic economy. So I will retain entrepreneurs' relief, but to ensure it is going to genuine entrepreneurs, I will extend the minimum qualifying period from 12 months to 2 years. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the period since the last budget, we've explored all avenues to address the cliff edge effect of VAT registration, but our options are restricted by EU law. We will continue to work on this issue as our future VAT regime becomes clear over the years ahead. And in the meantime, to give small businesses certainty, and in response to representations from my right honourable friend, the member for Mid Worcestershire, the FSB and others, I will leave the threshold unchanged for a further 2 years. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the off-payroll working rules, known as IR35, are designed to ensure fairness, so that individuals working side by side in a similar role for the same employer pay the same employment taxes. Last year, we changed the way these rules are enforced in the public sector, but widespread non-compliance also exists in the private sector. So following our consultation, we will now apply the same changes to private sector organisations as well. But after listening carefully to representations made, including many from my honourable and right honourable friends, during the consultation, we will delay these changes until April 2020, and we will only apply them to large and medium-sized businesses. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is one standout example of where the rules of the game must evolve now if they are to keep up with the emerging digital economy. Digital platforms delivering search engines, social media and online marketplaces have changed our lives, our society and our economy, mostly for the better. But they also pose a real challenge for the sustainability and fairness of our tax system. The rules have simply not kept pace with changing business models, and it is clearly not sustainable or fair that digital platform businesses can generate substantial value in the UK without paying tax here in respect of that business. The UK has been leading attempts to deliver international corporate tax reform for the digital age. A new global agreement is the best long-term solution, but progress is painfully slow. We cannot simply talk forever. So we will now introduce a UK digital services tax. This will be a narrowly targeted tax on the UK-generated revenues of specific digital platform business models. It will be carefully designed to ensure it is established tech giants rather than our tech startups that shoulder the burden of this new tax. It is important that I emphasise that this is not an online sales tax on goods ordered over the internet. Such a tax would fall on consumers of those goods, and that is not our intention. The digital services tax will only be paid by companies which are profitable and which generate at least £500 million a year in global revenues in the business lines in scope. We will consult on the detail to make sure we get it right and to ensure that the UK continues to be the best place in the world to start and scale up a tech business. The tax will come into effect in April 2020 and is expected to raise over £400 million a year. In the meantime, we will continue to work at the OECD and the G20 to seek a globally agreed solution, and if one emerges, we will consider adopting it in place of the UK digital services tax. But this step shows that we are serious about this reform because, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is only right that these global giants with profitable businesses in the UK pay their fair share towards supporting our public services. And, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am already looking forward to my call from the former leader of the Liberal Democrats. We're updating the rules of the game, but we must also make sure that people play by the rules. And today, we continue the work of the past 8 years, where we've secured £185 billion since 2010, which would otherwise have gone unpaid, with a package of measures today to further clamp down on tax avoidance, evasion and unfair outcomes, raising another £2 billion over the next 5 years. We will make HMRC a preferred creditor in business insolvencies to ensure that tax which has been collected on behalf of HMRC is actually paid to HMRC. We'll end the practice of purchasing services through overseas branches to avoid UK VAT, and we'll crack down on insurance companies routing services through offshore territories. And we'll stop our generous R&D tax credit system being abused by reintroducing a PAYE restriction for the small and medium-sized companies scheme. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Labour talk tough on tax avoidance and evasion. We take action. Mr. Deputy Speaker, investing in our infrastructure, backing the technologies of the future, supporting British businesses, updating our tax system for the digital age. That is how we will deliver the high-wage, high-skill economy of the future. But we must also recognise that technological change will bring challenges as well as opportunities. And there is one part of our economy that is currently confronting that challenge in spades: our high streets. Embedded in the fabric of our great cities, towns and villages, the high street lies at the heart of many communities, and it is under pressure as never before as Britain adopts online shopping with greater alacrity than any other large economy. So if Britain's high streets are to remain at the centre of our community life, they will need to adapt. Today, we support them to do so, responding to calls from across this House, especially from my right honourable friend, the member for Putney, and my honourable friends, the members for Southport and Croydon South. We will provide £675 million of co-funding to create a future High Streets Fund to support councils to draw up formal plans for the transformation of their high streets, to invest in the improvements they need and to facilitate redevelopment of underused retail and commercial areas into residential. At one and the same time, Mr. Deputy Speaker, helping with the housing challenge and delivering much-needed footfall to high street businesses. We will consult on how modernisation of the use classes order and the CPO regime can help facilitate the transformation of the high street. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the change that our high streets face is irreversible, and it will take them time to adapt to it. But I know that many small retail businesses are struggling to cope with the high fixed costs of business rates. Since 2016, we've introduced business rates relief measures worth £12 billion, and many of these reliefs will have benefited high street businesses. But today I can go further. At the next revaluation in 2021, rateable values will adjust to reflect changes in rental values. But I want to help retail businesses now. So for the next 2 years, up to that revaluation, for all retailers in England with a rateable value of £51,000 or less, I will cut their business rates bill by 1/3. That is an annual saving of up to £8,000 for up to 90% of all independent shops, pubs, restaurants and cafes. I will also extend the £1,500 local newspaper discount for a further year. Mr Deputy Speaker, whatever the national press says, I've been assured of a warm welcome for my budget from the Royston Crow and the Keswick Reminder. Mr Deputy Speaker, local authorities have long been able to provide discretionary business rates relief to other bodies, but not to themselves. And so, following representations from my honourable friends for North Cornwall and St Austell and Newquay, I'm pleased to announce a new mandatory business rates relief for public lavatories, so that local authorities can at last relieve themselves for the convenience of the House, Mr Deputy Speaker, and without wishing to get unduly bogged down on this subject, this relief, the House will be interested to know that this relief, well, at least I'm demonstrating that we are all British, aren't I? This relief will extend to any such facilities made available for public use, whether publicly or privately owned. And honestly, Mr Deputy Speaker, I can say that this is virtually the only announcement in this budget that hasn't leaked. Mr Deputy Speaker, Mr Deputy Speaker, we can't resolve the productivity challenge or deliver the high standards of living the British people deserve without fixing our housing market. In last year's budget, I launched a 5-year, £44 billion housing programme to deliver the biggest increase in housing supply since 1970, and I abolished stamp duty for first-time buyers on properties up to £300,000. 121,500 first-time buyers have already benefited from our new relief, and the number of first-time buyers is at an 11-year high. Today, I'm extending this relief to all first-time buyers of shared ownership properties valued up to £500,000, and I will make this relief retrospective so that any first-time buyer who has made such a purchase since the last budget will benefit. But we have more to do, so I can announce today a further £500 million for the Housing Infrastructure Fund to unlock a further 650,000 homes, the next wave of strategic partnerships with 9 housing associations, which will deliver 13,000 homes across England, up to £1 billion of British Business Bank guarantees to support the revival of SME house builders. We're consulting on simplification of the process for conversion of commercial property into new homes, and because we want to see parishes and neighbourhoods enabling more homes for sale to local people to buy at prices they can afford, we're providing funding to empower up to 500 neighbourhoods to allocate or permission land for housing through the neighbourhood planning system for sale at a discount to local people in perpetuity. I'm also grateful to my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, for his review of build-out rates published today. He concludes that the large house builders are not engaged in systematic speculative land banking, and he makes several recommendations. Well, maybe the honourable lady would like to read the report. He makes several recommendations for reform of the planning system in respect of very large strategic housing sites, and we will respond in full to his report in the new year. Mr Deputy Speaker, meeting the productivity challenge means tapping the potential of every region and nation. Our devolution agenda is giving power back to the people. And today, we go further to fire up the Northern Powerhouse, fuel the Midlands engine, and back our regions across the UK. We're increasing the Transforming Cities Fund to £2.4 billion and providing an additional £90 million to trial new models of smart transport, including on-demand buses. I think, Mr Deputy Speaker, that's what we used to call in our day taxis. We're launching a competition for proposals for business-led development corporations. We're funding 10 university enterprise zones. There's £115 million for digital catapults in the North East, Northern Ireland and the South East, and the Medicines Discovery Catapult in Alderley. £70 million to develop the Defence and National Rehabilitation Centre near Loughborough, £37 £37 million of additional development funding for Northern Powerhouse Rail, and £10 million for a new pilot in Manchester to support the self-employed to acquire new skills. We're backing a new special economic area in South Tees, and we're providing £20 million to further develop the plan for the critical central section of East-West Rail between Oxford and Cambridge. And here in our capital, we support the delivery of a further 19,000 homes by improving the Docklands Light Railway with Housing Infrastructure Fund money. Mr Deputy Speaker, the decisions announced in this budget means in 2021 an additional £950 million for the Scottish Government, £550 million for the Welsh Government and £320 million for a Northern Ireland executive. Obviously, much larger sums to come as we move ahead over the spending review period with our NHS funding change. I can also announce funding for further city and growth deals, including £150 million for Tay Cities, £350 million for Belfast and £120 million for North Wales, while negotiations progress with Ayrshire, Mid Wales and Borderlands, and will begin with Murray, Derry Londonderry and Strabane as well. I was pleased to be able to respond to a joint request from the members for Belfast North, Belfast East and Belfast South to provide the city with £2 million help towards the recovery of the city centre following the fire at the iconic Banks building. And we're also moving forward with schools projects in Northern Ireland worth £300 million to increase the provision of shared and integrated cross-community education. And we've agreed to the establishment of a working group to progress plans for short-haul APD devolution. To continue to support Scotland's oil and gas industry, we will maintain headline tax rates at their current level and launch a call for evidence on our plan to make Scotland a global hub for decommissioning. And finally, to support our vital fishing industry as we leave the EU, we'll invest £12 million over the next 3 years in cutting-edge fisheries technology and safety measures. A Conservative government, Mr Deputy Speaker, delivering for all our proud nations and for all our English regions, driving growth and prosperity across our United Kingdom. Mr Deputy Speaker, we are driven by a determination to ensure that the next generation will be more prosperous than ours. But we cannot secure our children's future unless we secure our planet's future. So at this budget, I take further action with a package of measures set out in the Red Book to ensure that we leave our environment in a better state than we inherited it. There is one particular measure I want to mention. The Shadow Chancellor's recent accident has reminded us all how dangerous abandoned waste can be. So I will provide £10 million to deal with abandoned waste sites, although I cannot guarantee to the House that £10 million is going to be enough to stop him falling flat on his face in the future. Mr Deputy Speaker, I also said at the spring statement that we must become a world leader in tackling the scourge of plastic littering our planet and our oceans. Billions of disposable plastic drinks cups, cartons, bags and other items are used every year in Britain. Convenient for consumers, but deadly for our wildlife and our oceans. Where we cannot achieve reuse, we are determined to increase recycling. So we will introduce a new tax on the manufacture and import of plastic packaging which contains less than 30% recycled plastic, transforming the economics of sustainable packaging. We will consult on the detail and implementation timetable. I have also looked carefully at the case for introducing a levy on the production of disposable plastic cups, not just for coffee, but for all types of beverage. I have concluded that a tax in isolation would not, at this point, deliver a decisive shift from disposable to reusable cups across all beverage types. I will monitor carefully the effectiveness of the action which the takeaway drinks industry is already taking to reduce single-use plastics, and I will return to this issue if sufficient progress is not made. But in parallel, my Right Honourable friend, the Environment Secretary, will look to address this issue through the reform of the Packaging Producer Responsibility Scheme. Working across government, this ambitious package reflects our determination to lead the world in the crusade to rid the oceans and the environment of plastic waste. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is only by dealing with our debts and tackling the long-term challenges our country faces that we can sustainably raise wages and living standards. But I recognise that many people are feeling pressure on their household budgets now. And because the hard work of the British people is paying off, I am pleased to be able to announce today a series of measures to help families across Britain with the cost of living. Mr. Deputy Speaker, turning first to duties, as my Right Honourable friend the Prime Minister has already announced, we will freeze fuel duties for the 9th successive year, bringing the total saving to the average car driver to over £1,000 and to the average van driver to over £2,500. The tobacco duty escalator will continue to rise at inflation plus 2%. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I've received numerous representations from my honourable and right honourable friends on one particular subject, and in response, I will be freezing beer and cider duty for the next year, keeping the cost of beer down for patrons of the Great British Pub. And in response to the concerted lobbying of my Scottish Conservative colleagues, I will also freeze duty on spirits, so that we can all afford to raise a wee dram to Ruth Davidson on the arrival of baby Finn. Saving 2p on a pint of beer, 1p on a pint of cider and 30p on a bottle of scotch or gin compared to the inflation assumption in the OBR forecast, while proceeding with the usual RPI increases on wine. As promised at Autumn Budget 2017, so-called white ciders will be taxed at a new higher rate. From October next year, I can confirm that we will increase remote gaming duty on online games of chance to 21% in order to fund the loss of revenue as we reduce FOB-T stakes to £2. From April 2020, APD will be indexed in line with inflation, but there will be no change in the duty rate for short-haul flights. And the new 2630 rail card, which I announced at budget last year, will be available across the network by the end of the year, saving up to 4.4 million young people 1/3 of their fares. And we launch a package of measures on affordable credit and support for credit unions, which is set out in detail in the Red Book. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the switch to universal credit is a long overdue and necessary reform. It replaces the broken system left by the last Labour government. A system, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that trapped millions on out-of-work benefits for nearly a decade. This is not just a welfare measure, it is a major structural reform to our economy that will help to drive growth and employment in the years ahead. And I pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Chingford, without whose tenacity universal credit would never have seen the light. But I recognise the genuine concerns among many honourable and right honourable friends about two issues. First, the implementation of this programme. It is an enormous undertaking, and we've always been clear we want the migration process to be as smooth as possible. I have already delivered nearly £3.5 billion to help with the transition, including a £1.5 billion package of support at last year's budget. Today, I can go further with a package of additional measures worth £1 billion over 5 years, enabling... What a surprise, Mr Deputy Speaker. What a surprising response from the opposition front bench. A package of measures to aid the transition worth £1 billion over 5 years, enabling my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, to introduce additional protections as existing welfare claimants move on to UC, and she will announce details when she introduces the managed migration regulations later this year. Secondly, I have heard the concerns about the rates and allowances within the design of the system. In my first autumn statement, I reduced the UC taper rate from 65% to 63%, and today I can tell the House that I am increasing work allowances in universal credit by £1,000 per annum at a cost of £1.7 billion annually once rollout is complete, benefiting 2.4 million working families with children, 2.4 million working families with children and people with disabilities by £630 per year. Mr Deputy Speaker, universal credit is here to stay, and we are putting in the funding it needs to make it a success, because on this side of the House we believe that work should always pay. Mr Deputy Speaker, delivering higher wages for those in work is core to my mission as Chancellor. Under this Conservative government, the poorest 20% have seen their real incomes grow faster than the richest 20%. And the proportion of jobs that are low paid is at its lowest level for 20 years, thanks to the national living wage introduced by a Conservative government in 2016. From April, it will rise again by 4.9%, from £7.83 to £8.21, handing a full-time worker a further £690 annual pay increase and taking his or her total pay rise since the introduction of national living wage to over £2,750 a year. We also accept the Low Pay Commission's recommendations on national minimum wage rates, supporting young people and apprentices with further above-inflation increases. The current remit for the Low Pay Commission is for the national living wage to reach 60% of median earnings by 2020, subject to sustained economic growth. But next year, we will need to give the Low Pay Commission a new remit beyond 2020. We will want to be ambitious with the ultimate objective of ending low pay in the UK. But we will also want to be careful protecting employment for lower paid workers. So we will engage responsibly with employers, the TUC and the Low Pay Commission itself over the coming months, gathering evidence and listening to views to ensure that we get this right, and I will confirm the final remit at the budget next year. But as well as making work pay, I hear the Honourable Lady, Mr Deputy Speaker, but her point is slightly blunted by the fact that she made it in the autumn of 2016, she made it again in the spring of 2017, and she made it again in the autumn of last year. But Mr Deputy Speaker, as well as making work pay, we want working people to keep more of the money they earn. When we came into office, the personal allowance stood at £6,475 and the higher rate threshold at £43,875. In April, I raised the personal allowance to £11,850 and the higher rate threshold to 46,350 as steps towards our manifesto commitments of 12,500 and 50,000 respectively by 2020. Those manifesto commitments were of course made before our new funding pledge to the NHS, and I have received representations that the least painful way for taxpayers to contribute to increased NHS funding would be to abandon our manifesto pledges and freeze the personal allowance and the higher rate threshold at current levels. But let me reassure the House that, unlike the right honourable gentleman opposite, my idea of ending austerity does not involve increasing people's tax bills. I didn't come into politics to put taxes up, and the improvement we have delivered in the public finances means that, based on the OBR's forecast published today, I do not need to do so. I can therefore confirm today that I will meet our manifesto commitments in April 2020, raising the personal allowance to £12,500 and the higher rate threshold to £50,000 before indexing both in line with inflation from 21-22. But our careful management of the economy allows me to go further. So I will raise both the personal allowance and the higher rate threshold to these levels from April 2019, delivering our manifesto commitments 1 year early. A tax cut for 32 million people, £130 in the pocket of a typical basic rate taxpayer, meaning since 2015 we've taken 1.7 million people out of tax altogether and nearly 1 million people out of higher rate tax. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, as a result of the announcements I have made today, a single parent receiving universal credit and working 25 hours a week on national living wage will benefit by £890 next year. The hard work of the British people paying off in hard cash in their pockets. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we have turned an important corner, and now we must pull together to build the bright, prosperous future that is within Britain's grasp if we choose to seize it. Embracing change, not hiding from it. Building on the inherent strength of the British economy and the indomitable spirit of the British people. Mr. Deputy Speaker, under this Conservative government, austerity is coming to an end, but discipline will remain. Austerity is coming to an end, but discipline will remain. And that is the clear dividing line in British politics today between a Conservative government delivering on the British people's priorities, supporting our public services, investing in Britain's future, keeping taxes low and getting our debt down, or the Corbyn Party, whose idea of ending austerity is to raise taxes to their highest level in peacetime history, who would send our debt soaring, who would squander the hard-won achievements of the past 8 years and take this country back to square one. We are at a turning point in our history, and we must resolve to go forwards, not backwards, and work together to build a Britain that we can all be proud of. And I commend this statement to the House.
Under Standing Order number 51, the first motion, entitled Provisional Collection of Taxes, must be decided without debate. Will the Chancellor of the Exchequer please move formally?
Formally, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
The question is that, pursuant of Section 5 of the Provisional Collection of Taxes Act 1968, provisional statutory effect shall be given to the following motions. A. Stamp duty reserve tax, brackets listed securities and connected persons, brackets, motion number 49. B. Tobacco products. Please. Order. Can I just say to honourable members need to listen to what's going to affect their constituents. I will say once again that honourable members may be interested in what affects their constituents, because I certainly am. And what I would say, we won't know what affects them and what doesn't until I can complete it. And let us complete it. And I don't need any help from the light benches. Right. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I now call upon the Chancellor of the Exchequer to move the motion entitled Income Tax (brackets charge). It is on the motion that the debate will take place today and on succeeding days. The questions on this motion and on the remaining motions will be put at the end of the budget debate on Thursday, the 1st of November. Minister to move. The question is the income tax charge for the tax year 2019-20 and declared that it is expedient and in the public interest that this resolution should have statutory effect under the provisions of the Revised Collection of Taxes Act. I now call the Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the reality is that whatever the Chancellor claims today, austerity is not over. And far from building a strong economy, 8 years of austerity has damaged our economy, delayed and weakened the recovery and endlessly postponed fixing the deficit. Unnecessary austerity has caused real hardship to millions of our fellow citizens, held down living standards for the majority and failed on its own terms. Mr Deputy Speaker, people have had enough.
Order. Just sit in.
Order. Wants to kid the public, he's ditching it.
Can I just say that we heard the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I expect to hear the Leader of the Opposition. Those who may have been put themselves in a position thinking I can't see them, yes I can. And I don't want to hear any more. I want to hear the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the same way that your constituents do. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister pledged austerity is over. This, Mr Deputy Speaker, is a broken promise budget. What we've heard today are half measures and quick fixes while austerity grinds on. And far from people's hard work and sacrifices having paid off, as the Chancellor claims, this government has frittered it away in ideological tax cuts to the richest in our society. This budget won't undo the damage done by 8 years of austerity and doesn't begin to measure up to the scale of the job that needs to be done to rebuild Britain. The government claims austerity has worked, so now they can end it. But that is absolutely the opposite of the truth. Austerity needs to end because it has failed. Just 2 years ago, he forecast growth of 2.1% next year and the year after. Today, he boasts he's created robust economic growth, but the forecasts have been dropped to just 1.6% next year and 1.4% the year after. Economic growth in the first half of this year was the slowest since 2011. The last year, we had the lowest growth of any major economy. This is not a strong economy, but a weak one, with chronically low investment, low wages and low productivity. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, the uncertainty caused by this government's shambolic handling of Brexit is making things even worse. The warnings come...
Order. Mr Bowen, Mr Philp, I expect better. You're very obviously right in my sight, so I suspect you either go quietly out of the chamber if you can't behave. Jeremy Corbyn.
Very good. The warnings come from across the economy, the car industry, farming and food, road haulage. UK manufacturing is currently in recession. So much for the much vaunted March of the Makers. Mr Deputy Speaker, they said austerity would mean the deficit would close by 2015. Today, the Chancellor has confirmed it will still be there 9 years later in 2024. Even now, great chunks of the deficit have simply been palmed off to others, not eradicated, moved into the accounts of NHS trusts, shuffled onto the books of local councils that have collapsed, with many more on the brink, and most worryingly and frightening for many people, loaded onto the very fast rising levels of personal and household debt. For too long, the party opposite peddled the myth that the last Labour government crashed the economy by overspending on public services. As if, Mr Deputy Speaker, investing to bring health spending, as the last Labour government did, up to European levels had caused the global financial crash. Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, we believe that spending on public services is an investment that benefits the health of our people and the economy of our country. This morning, the Health Secretary said that it would take a generation to achieve parity of esteem of mental health, and refused to say whether the money was ring-fenced. And that money is only half of what leading mental health experts say is necessary. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, the impact of austerity on our people's health is more than the NHS funding. Improvements in life expectancy are stalling for the first time in modern history, and in the poorest areas of our country, life expectancy is actually falling and child mortality is rising. The National Health Service, our precious National Health Service, is a thermometer of the well-being of our society. But the illness is austerity, cuts to social care, failure to invest in housing, and slashing of real social security. It has one inevitable consequence. People's health has got worse and demands on the National Health Service have increased. 1.4 million elderly people not getting the care they need. Tory cuts have taken £7 billion, Mr Deputy Speaker, from social care budgets. Today's announcement is a drop in the ocean, both for adult and child social care. And at this time of rising demand, nurse numbers are falling, GP numbers are falling, health visitor numbers are falling, and there are 10,000 vacancies for doctors in our National Health Service. Under the last Labour government, the NHS budgets averaged an increase of 6% a year. That's been slashed to just 1.4% under this government. The Health Foundation says the government's much heralded extra money for the National Health Service is, and I quote, simply not enough. While the IFS says funding at this level will only maintain current levels. And let's remember what the current levels are in the NHS. Record waiting times at accident and emergency.
Mr Hoare, I think we know better. We caught each other's eye before. I won't want to catch it again. Seriously, you might think Halloween's for screaming. It is not what I want to hear in this chamber. General Corbyn.
4.3 million people on National Health Service waiting lists, longer waits to start cancer treatment. We need to go further, which is why, as we pledged in our manifesto, Labour will raise taxes to the highest earners to fund an increase above the government's baseline. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's not only the National Health Service that is in crisis. Defence spending has actually been cut, the size of the army has been cut by a fifth, and whilst we welcome the donation-based whilst we welcome the donation based on VAT gains to commemorate the armistice and 1.7 million more for educational programmes to ensure people learn the horrors of the Holocaust, and I join with the Chancellor in absolutely condemning the horrific and vile anti-Semitic and racist attack that occurred in Pittsburgh over the weekend. We stand together with those under threat from the far right, wherever it may be, anywhere on this planet. The Conservatives used to claim to be the party of law and order. Now they can't even maintain law and order in our prisons. Assaults at record levels as depleted staff try to cope with a difficult situation. And our streets are less safe too. Police numbers are down, violent crime is up, and convictions are down. Chief constables are warning that criminals are taking advantage, and police officers are having to take the government to court. The police officers taking the government to court just to get a pay rise. After 8 years of austerity, firefighters today are paid £6,700 less than they were 10 years ago. Nurses, £4,750. Teachers, £4,650. Every public sector worker deserves a decent pay rise. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, 60% of teachers are not getting it. Neither are the police nor the government's own civil service workers. Cleaners and security guards in the Ministry of Justice and the Department of Business still aren't even getting the London living wage. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the gap between those at the very top and the rest is not closing, it's growing. The pay of chief executives of our biggest companies rose by 11% this year, paying themselves 145 times more than the workers in the companies that they lead. At the other end of the scale, 6.3 million workers are paid less than the real living wage, up 300,000 in the last year alone. The very lowest earners and insecure workers on 0 hours contracts or short hours contracts will not benefit from the increase in the threshold, and they are the very people being punished by the cuts still hardwired into universal credit. The Chancellor boasts of a balanced approach. But what is balanced about cutting social security for disabled people or slashing services to the bone? But when by the end of this Parliament they will have doled out £110 billion in tax giveaways to corporations and the super rich. Meanwhile, in the real world, homelessness has more than doubled, fewer people able to buy a home, household debt rising, child poverty is up now to over 4 million and rising, and more disabled people are living in poverty also. Far from tackling the burning injustices, as the Prime Minister said her government was going to do, they have actually made them worse and increased the injustices in our society. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission warned just last week that Britain is becoming a two-speed society, all right for the richest few and failing for the many. This government is harsh on the weak and feeble with the strong. They labelled good people scroungers and skivers while they imposed punitive sanctions, demeaning assessments and a benefits freeze, none of which has been reversed today. The universal credit is causing increases in poverty, food bank use, rent arrears and homelessness. When even the Work and Pensions Secretary admits that some people will be worse off, and the architect of universal credit says the system is underfunded, then it was inevitable the Chancellor would have to act, though he is only reversing barely half of the cuts made. However, the problems of universal credit are also structural, harming the self-employed, lone parents, people with larger families and survivors of domestic abuse. That is why we believe the rollout must be halted immediately. Mr. Deputy Speaker, since 2010, 86% of the cuts through tax and benefit measures have come from women. And there was not even recognition, let alone money set aside, for the women born in the 1950s who've been denied pension justice. Women in Britain today have just 1/5 of the pension wealth of men, in part because of the grotesque gender pay gap, which at current rates will not close until 2073. And there was no extra money to fund women's refuges, a lifeline for women fleeing from domestic abuse. Since 2010, almost 1/5 of all refuges have been forced to close. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, months after the scale of the Windrush scandal became clear, the Chancellor has failed to set up a hardship fund for those affected, let alone the compensation scheme for the hundreds of people wronged by the Prime Minister's nasty and perverse hostile environment. And we heard no guarantees for older people. Free TV licences for the over 75s remain at risk by the government that threatened to tear up the triple lock, take away the winter fuel allowance from millions and force people in need to pay for care at home. Mr Deputy Speaker, a country that fails its young people is failing its own future. Schools' funding per pupil has been cut by 8%. The college budget has been slashed and the adult skills budget has been hacked by 45%. And there are 123,000 children in this country living in temporary accommodation, causing them unbelievable levels of stress and uncertainty and consequently often underachievement in schools. Children's services face a $2 billion funding gap. We now have the highest number of children being taken into care since 1985. Last Saturday, I visited North City Children's Centre in Norwich, threatened with closure due to council cuts. With too many children in Sure Start centres already closed, the users of that wonderful centre were very frightened of their future because they had benefited, like so many others have in so many other parts of the country, from the great achievement of the last Labour government, which was children's centres and the Sure Start initiative all over the country. Spending on youth services has fallen by 62%. 600 youth centres have closed. There are 3,500 fewer youth workers. The UK, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the only major global economy in which investment is falling. UK business investment is the lowest in the G7. This failure to invest means Britain's productivity is 15% lower than major economies. Public sector investment is over $18 billion lower than it was in 2010. Britain is the most regionally unequal country in Europe, with 6 of the 10 poorest regions in Northern Europe in this country. And the government reinforces these disparities. Let's just take an example. When it comes to transport funding, the North receives $2,500 less per person than London, while people in the Midlands get $1,900 less. So much for the Northern powerhouse and the Midlands engine. Local economies are also struggling, Mr Deputy Speaker. Over 100,000 retail jobs have been lost in the last 3 years. There are 25,000 boarded up premises across Britain. A visit to many of our high streets is to see roller-blind shutters on shops that are being closed because of job losses and the problems they face. The Chancellor's business rate announcement today only unpicks his own disastrous revaluation last year. And the Chancellor has again delayed slashing the maximum stake on fixed odds betting terminals. But he will not solve the crisis on our high streets until he firstly tackles the institutionalised tax avoidance of big online retailers. His digital services tax announced today is too little and too late. Secondly, the Chancellor must tackle the levels of household debt driven by low wages. High streets won't thrive until people have money to spend. So we hope he will endorse our call for the minimum wage to be a real living wage of at least £10 an hour by 2020 and removing the discriminatory youth rates from the system. Mr Deputy Speaker, this Chancellor has again failed to back Labour's plan to create a national investment bank with regional development banks. Today's announcement on broadband investment is a very small step, but Britain ranks 35th in the global rankings of broadband speeds. Currently, just 2% of UK premises have full fibre broadband compared to 80% in Spain and 100% in South Korea. This government still lacks any meaningful strategy for creating high-skilled jobs in every region and nation, and failing abysmally to invest in the industries of the future necessary to tackle climate change. The IPCC report this month was clear on the consequences. We can only avoid climate catastrophe if we act now. The government's response has been to cut support for our solar industries, losing 12,000 jobs in the process, slash the building of onshore wind, cut subsidies for electric vehicles, sell off the Green Investment Bank, and instead to back fracking in the face of overwhelming local and scientific opposition. 10 years ago, it was a Labour government that passed the Climate Change Act, world-leading legislation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. This government is not even on target to do that. Clean energy investment fell 56% last year, and the UK produces less of our energy from renewables than Germany, Spain, France or Italy. This government is, I believe, Mr Deputy Speaker, failing to protect our environment and, in doing so, failing to protect all of our futures. The extra $500 million announced today to help the government cope with Brexit is not about planning, but about panic. And that panic is very deep-rooted. Yesterday, the Chancellor said another budget would be necessary to set out a new economic strategy in the event of a no-deal Brexit. This morning, the Prime Minister said all these spending commitments are funded irrespective of a deal. It's very clear, Mr Speaker, if they can't agree a good deal with the EU, it's because they can't agree a deal amongst themselves in the Cabinet or in the Tory party. So as we approach the crucial stage of the government's bungled Brexit negotiations, we face a choice about the sort of economy we want. Some on the benches opposite fantasise about taking Britain down the road and the path to being a Singapore-style tax haven with a race to the bottom in rights and protections. That must be rejected outright. What we need is an active government that will invest in our people in every region and every nation of our country, that will use the wealth we create to fund world-class public services. What's needed, Mr Deputy Speaker, is a real break with austerity and a government committed to raising investment across the board to rebuild our economy, communities and public services. That is a route to a country that could work for all. Austerity is not over, and the quick fixes and half measures we've heard today do not begin to measure up to the scale of the job that needs to be done to rebuild Britain.
Chair of the Select Committee for Treasury, Nicky Morgan.
Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you very much indeed. It must be something that I've said as everybody leaves the chamber, or perhaps something that the honourable member for Islington North did not say, because the Chancellor had a difficult job today. He had a conflicting economic outlook as he prepared today's budget, but he has offered solutions and a vision for the future, unlike the Leader of the Opposition, from whom we have heard no